On the evening of Monday, October 15th, 1962, the truth of the Soviet missile deployment in Cuba began to trickle into Washington's highest levels.
And it didn't arrive in some big dramatic briefing. It was fragmented, almost quiet.
Exactly. It was interrupting these very routine diplomatic moments.
You think of Secretary of State Dean Rusk, he's hosting a formal dinner for the German foreign minister.
Right, in the State Department's dining room.
Right.
And a waiter just discreetly hands him a note.
That's the image, isn't it? The height of institutional composure just shattered by this raw intelligence.
Rusk takes the call, hears the news, and then, and this is incredible, he goes right back to his guests.
He just resumes a conversation about NATO structure. The outward calm is almost impossible to believe.
But he manages to signal Paul Nitze, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, to join him.
And they step out onto the terrace, overlooking the Lincoln Memorial of all places.
And that's where he tells him, in a whisper, with the monuments of American democracy lit up in the background.
The whole crisis starts in this very strange, almost theatrical way.
It wasn't just Rusk, though. The physical evidence itself was on the move.
Defense Secretary Robert McNamara gets home to Hickory Hill after an evening out.
And the analysts are already there, waiting for him. They have the images laid out on a table.
And then there's the White House. The news gets there through McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor.
He's at a farewell dinner for Chip Ballin, who's about to become the ambassador to France.
And he gets this cryptic call from the CIA's Ray Klein.
The line was, "Those things we've been worrying about, it looks as though we've really got something."
And Bundy, with his reputation for being so sharp, he knew exactly what that meant. No explanation needed.
We should probably talk about Bundy for a moment, because his personality really did shape the first hours of this.
Oh, absolutely. He was the quintessential Boston Brahmin, a star at Groton, then Yale, and he was the dean of Harvard by 34. Just incredibly precocious.
He came into the Kennedy administration as the supreme can-do man. He embodied that high-energy confidence.
People respected him, but he wasn't exactly loved, was he? He was seen as intensely clever, but maybe impatient with people who weren't on his level.
The journalist Walter Lippmann thought he should have been Secretary of State. He had the president's ear, and by 62, Kennedy considered him indispensable.
But that was a blind spot, and the history on this is pretty clear. This inner circle, for all their intelligence, had a very narrow worldview.
Very East Coast elite.
Exactly. A meager understanding of other cultures. They hadn't traveled much. Their confidence was so high, it sometimes tipped over into arrogance.
And that context really informs Bundy's next decision, which is a crucial one.
It is. He knows what this intelligence means, and he has to decide whether to wake up the president,
who is completely exhausted from campaigning in New York for the midterm elections.
And Bundy makes the call to wait. He decides to let Kennedy rest.
He believed a few hours wouldn't make a difference.
Which, depending on how you look at it, is either an act of incredible confidence or monumental recklessness.
It says that even when faced with a potential global catastrophe, he believed the American system could afford a few hours to think.
That decision set the clock. The next morning, Tuesday, October 16th, the crisis would officially begin.
The briefing that morning took place in the White House private quarters, the mansion. Bundy met Kennedy while the president was still in his pajamas.
And the mood must have already been tense. Kennedy would have already seen the morning papers, which were all about Cuba.
Right. The Washington Post had an article suggesting the West might have to offer concessions in Berlin just to slow down the Soviets in Cuba.
So the administration was already on the defensive. And then there was Eisenhower.
Former President Eisenhower had just given a speech attacking Kennedy's foreign policy.
He said that under his watch, no walls were built, no threatening foreign bases were established. It was a direct political attack.
So Kennedy is being called soft on foreign policy, literally hours before he learns about the single greatest foreign threat in the country's history. The pressure is just immense.
It's staggering. And into that atmosphere, Bundy delivers the news.
Hard photographic evidence that the Russians have offensive missiles in Cuba.
And Kennedy had repeatedly, publicly said he wouldn't tolerate that. And the Soviets had privately assured him they wouldn't do it. They were direct lies.
So Kennedy's reaction is, first and foremost, personal. A sense of betrayal.
He can't do this to me. It wasn't about grand strategy in that first moment. It was an affront.
But his immediate strategic thought was just as visceral. He said, "We're probably going to have to bomb them."
And when Robert Kennedy was brought in, his reaction was even more blunt.
Oh, shit. Shit. Those sons of bitches Russians.
The feeling across the board among the analysts was just shocked incredulity because they had basically talked themselves into believing this couldn't happen.
Why, though? Why the shock? The intelligence had been pointing in this direction for months, hadn't it?
It had, but the official analysis, particularly from the CIA's Office of National Estimates, was that it was strategically implausible. They thought it was too risky for the Soviets, a disproportionate move. So they officially rejected the possibility.
It was a case of self-deception then.
Absolutely. And the great irony is that the one person who had been consistently warning the White House that this was exactly what Khrushchev intended was the CIA director himself, John McCone.
And McConey was out of town attending a funeral on this most critical day.
Yes. So Kennedy moves immediately. The first thing he does is dictate a list, 14 names, the people he wants in the room for a meeting that morning.
And that group would become what historians now call Excom, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council.
Though it's interesting, the members themselves didn't really recall using that name at the time. It was just the group.
The list was diverse. You had Bundy, Rusk, George Ball, McNamara, RFK, General Maxwell Taylor, Vice President Johnson.
It was his core team. But he also wanted outsiders. He reached out to John McCloy, a veteran Republican lawyer, and told him to stay in touch even though he was leaving for Germany.
He wanted the smartest people, not just the people who had to be there.
Before that big meeting, though, Kennedy met with Chip Bolin, the diplomat.
And Bolin immediately urged caution. He saw the photos, and right away he raised the point that a surprise bombing, one that killed Soviet citizens, would force the Kremlin to escalate.
It's the first articulation of what became known as the Bolin Plan, the diplomatic cautious path.
Which stood in immediate contrast to the military's fast-track option.
You have to remember the uncertainty of that moment. An aide later said, nobody knew if this crisis would last 13 days or 13 weeks, or if they'd all be turned to ash somewhere in between.
The advisors started filing into the cabinet room at 11:50 a.m. for the first formal meeting.
And the centerpiece of that meeting was the intelligence briefing itself. Arthur Lendl from the National Photographic Interpretation Center, or NPIC, led it.
They set up these big photo displays on easels. This was the hard proof.
They'd identified sites near the Sierra del Rosario in west central Cuba, and the level of detail they had from these high-altitude photos is just remarkable.
They could see at least 14 missile trailers covered in canvas, and they'd used a new computer to measure them precisely. 67 feet long.
You could also see launchers, erectors, all the support equipment.
And that precision allowed their missile expert, Sid Graybiel, to identify the missile types.
The SS-3, which had about a 630-mile range, but more importantly, the SS-4.
The SS-4 had a range of 1,100 miles. It could deliver a nuclear warhead to Washington, D.C., and much of the eastern United States.
But the briefing ran straight into a critical missing piece of information.
The warheads.
Exactly. The photos didn't show any nose cones. The analysts figured they probably weren't fitted to the missiles yet.
And McNamara jumped on this immediately.
He did. He pointed out the lack of fencing. His logic was that if you have nuclear warheads stockpiled and ready to go, you'd have extensive security. Fences, barriers, guards.
And none of that was visible in the photos, which suggested they weren't fully operational.
It was a crucial observation. It meant they might have a little time.
The immediate decision then was that they needed more data, more photos.
And the president authorized more U-2 flights right away, even knowing the risk.
Once the facts were on the table, the discussion pivoted to the great policy divide: diplomacy or force.
Dean Rusk kicked it off. He acknowledged how serious this was, admitting they had not really believed the Soviets could carry this far.
But his immediate concern wasn't just a U.S. response. It was about the Allies.
Yes, he urged them not to act unilaterally. He pointed out there were 42 allies whose interests were at stake. He feared that a sudden, violent American action could shatter the entire alliance structure.
He was arguing for legitimacy over speed. He wanted to involve the Organization of American States, the OAS, to build a consensus.
He even suggested sending a back-channel warning to Castro, maybe through Canada or Brazil.
His whole approach was about giving Moscow an off-ramp, a chance to de-escalate.
He wanted to signal to Khrushchev that this was an utterly serious crisis, something the Soviet leader might not fully grasp yet. He wanted to give everyone a chance to pull away from it before it gets too hard.
So there it was. The two forks in the road were established on that first day: the diplomatic Bolin plan or the military fast track.
Robert McNamara, even though he would later become a voice for restraint, was the one who first laid out the case for military action with this clinical urgency.
He said if they were going to strike the missile sites, it had to happen before they became operational.
Because if they waited, even for a day or two, the Soviets might be able to launch one of those SS-4s against an American city before the site was destroyed.
Which meant that if they chose the military path, it had to be a surprise attack.
And a comprehensive one. McNamara stressed it couldn't be a small pinprick strike. It had to take out the airfields, the fighter jets, any potential warhead storage sites.
And he acknowledged the human cost. He estimated several thousand Cuban casualties, though the issue of killing Soviet personnel was, at this stage, still sort of lurking in the background.
The military's position was delivered by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Maxwell Taylor.
Taylor was a key figure, very handsome, polished, and Kennedy trusted him. But he had his critics, didn't he?
He did. Some of his military peers saw him as more of a political operator, a palace intriguer than a pure strategist. He was also famously the only person who raised his hand when Kennedy once sarcastically asked who in the room still believed in the so-called missile gap.
So Taylor, speaking for the Air Force, was immediately hawkish.
Extremely. He said the Air Force wanted to strike hard and fast before anything could be camouflaged. He argued for one hard crack.
He proposed 5 days of bombing, just a massive, overwhelming assault.
He also mentioned a naval blockade, but only as a secondary measure to stop reinforcements. The main event for him was the airstrike.
But in his push for a strike, Taylor overlooked some pretty significant problems.
He did. These omissions were potentially disastrous. First, he never acknowledged that it would be impossible to identify all the targets. The idea of a clean surgical strike was a fantasy.
Second, aerial bombing is an inexact science. There was no guarantee they'd get everything. One missile surviving could mean catastrophe.
And most critically, he downplayed the certainty of heavy Soviet casualties and the inevitable retaliation that would follow. Maybe in Berlin, maybe somewhere else. He presented this huge gamble as a clean solution.
And once that military logic was on the table, it began to escalate.
Deputy Undersecretary Alexis Jisenson made the point that if you're already committed to rolling airstrikes, you might as well think about whether we can eradicate the whole problem.
Meaning invasion.
Precisely. General Taylor agreed, saying we should be in a position to invade at any time. For the military, destroying the missiles was just the first step. The ultimate goal was regime change in Cuba.
McNamara estimated an invasion would take about 90,000 men. And when asked if that was enough, Taylor's response was almost casual.
At least it's enough to start the thing going. It shows you the maximalist thinking that was dominating the military's advice.
But even as the Hawks were pushing for action, serious doubts were already coming up.
Mostly from the civilian side, and again led by McNamara, he kept coming back to the warhead question. He said if the Soviets already had nuclear warheads on site, the calculus for an airstrike changed completely.
The problem was they just didn't know. They had no intelligence on the Soviet command and control over any potential warheads.
McNamara also brought up the Cuban Air Force, specifically their MiG-21 jets. He argued that they had to assume these planes were also nuclear capable.
And he warned that even a small number of them could likely penetrate U.S. coastal air defenses.
So an American airstrike on Cuba could immediately trigger a retaliatory Cuban airstrike on Florida. It added a layer of unacceptable risk to the whole plan.
But beyond the military logistics, the biggest question was simply, why? The Soviet motive was a complete enigma to them.
The scale of the deception was what baffled them. The Soviets had been shipping this equipment since July, all while giving private and public assurances that it was purely defensive.
The Americans saw the ongoing tension over Berlin as a distraction, a matador's cloak, to draw their attention away from the Caribbean.
Dean Rusk just couldn't square it. If Khrushchev was so smart, why would he so badly misread how sensitive Cuba was to the United States? And why weren't the sites better camouflaged? Why weren't they shooting down the U-2s that were flying right over them?
The only conclusion they could draw was that Khrushchev's irresponsibility was so breathtaking that it was almost impossible to comprehend. They were completely baffled.
This uncertainty about his motives, about whether he'd thought through the consequences at all, was terrifying. It made predicting his reaction to an American move almost impossible.
And all of this was happening under a blanket of total secrecy. McNamara figured they could keep a lid on it for a week at most.
The secrecy was also deeply embarrassing for the administration.
Because Senator Keating had already been on the Senate floor claiming that the Soviets were building intermediate-range missile sites in Cuba.
And the administration had been flatly, publicly denying it. Kennedy joked grimly that Keating might end up being the next president. They'd spent their credibility denying a truth that was about to explode into public view.
Vice President Johnson brought a dose of political reality to the table.
Johnson knew the country's mood. He said the nation's blood pressure is up and they are fearful and they're insecure.
And he reminded them that the administration had repeatedly promised to act if the Soviet buildup ever became offensive.
He knew the American public would demand a forceful response regardless of what the European allies thought.
Kennedy's gut instinct had been for military action, but the sheer weight of the debate was already causing him to pause.
He later said, "If we had to act in the first 24 hours, I don't think probably we would have chosen as prudently as we finally did."
Robert Kennedy also stressed how important that secrecy was. It gave them time to talk, to argue, to disagree.
He believed if it had all been public, the political pressure would have forced a much faster, much riskier decision.
So Kennedy ended that first day's meeting by ordering up plans for a limited airstrike. His objective was clear.
We're going to take out these missiles. It was merely a question of how.
The second Excom session convened that evening, Tuesday the 16th, at 6:30 p.m.
And McGeorge Bundy kicked it off with a very direct question for McNamara.
He asked if this deployment in Cuba fundamentally changed the strategic balance of power.
And McNamara's answer became the intellectual core of the blockade argument. He said his personal view was, not at all.
Not at all. That seems counterintuitive.
He backed it up with what you might call Cold War math. The U.S. had about 5,000 operational nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union had maybe 300.
So in his view, adding another 40 missiles in Cuba didn't change the overwhelming U.S. superiority.
Exactly. He argued this wasn't really a military threat. It was a political problem.
He also brought in the technological angle, pointing to the new submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the SLBMs.
His point was that these fixed, vulnerable, land-based missiles in Cuba were already becoming obsolete. The future was invisible submarines. So why risk a world war over a temporary threat?
But General Taylor immediately pushed back.
Vigorously. He argued the missiles could be an important reinforcement for the Soviets, giving them a first-strike credibility they didn't otherwise have.
But more than that, he made the political point that for the American people, the math didn't matter.
Right. Having enemy nuclear missiles next door felt fundamentally different from having them back in Russia. It was about psychology, proximity, national humiliation. You couldn't just dismiss that.
And that conflict between the cold math and the hot political reality is what led McNamara to propose his middle path.
The naval blockade, or as it was officially termed, a quarantine.
It was a brilliant move. It was an act of force. It showed resolve, but it wasn't immediately lethal like a bombing run.
It avoided that instant escalation. McNamara was deeply worried that a violent first move would trigger a Soviet military response somewhere else in the world, a response they weren't ready for.
The blockade bought them time. Time to negotiate, time to prepare, without giving up the option of using more force later.
The conversation then turned to communication. Should Kennedy reach out to Khrushchev privately first, give him a way to back down without losing face?
But the objection to that was overwhelming.
It was. The consensus was that a private message would hand the initiative back to Moscow. Khrushchev could then go public with his own version of the story, painting the U.S. as the aggressor.
Ted Sorensen tried to draft a letter, but he couldn't find a way to do it that wasn't either an ultimatum or something that would give Khrushchev time to make the missiles operational while he stalled.
They concluded that the window for a quiet diplomatic fix was already closed.
As the military planners started drawing up these detailed strike plans, the moral arguments against a surprise attack really started to gain momentum.
And this was led by Robert Kennedy and George Ball. RFK's point was pragmatic. Dropping bombs all over Cuba would be bloody, and it would probably lead to an invasion anyway.
But the moral weight was the real turning point. And George Ball was the one who brought up the Pearl Harbor analogy.
Ball argued that a surprise American attack would alienate a great part of the civilized world. He said it would go against everything the country had stood for.
He warned that they would be seen as global hypocrites, sacrificing their moral high ground for a tactical advantage that wasn't even guaranteed.
And that line of argument led to Robert Kennedy's famous, passionate rebuttal to Dean Acheson, who was pushing hard for a surprise strike.
RFK said his brother was not going to be the Tojo of the 1960s.
That comparison is just devastating. Comparing a potential American first strike to the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, it linked the president directly to an act of historical infamy.
Acheson dismissed it, of course. He argued the Monroe Doctrine had been a warning for over a century. But the point landed. For a president as concerned with his legacy as JFK, It was a powerful deterrent.
And that moral debate led to an exchange that really exposed the weakness in the American position.
Kennedy himself brought it up. He said the Soviet action was just as if we suddenly began to put a major number of MRBMs in Turkey. Now, that'd be goddamn dangerous, I would think.
And Bundy and Alexis Johnson had to gently remind him.
Well, we did, Mr. President.
Exactly. Not just in Turkey, but in England as well. Johnson pointed out that the U.S. had done it when they were short on long-range ICBMs, which was likely the same strategic logic Khrushchev was using now.
Kennedy tried to argue that was different, that it was 5 years earlier. But it was a weak defense.
It was, and it showed that Excom was unwilling to really confront the hypocrisy. They focused on the secrecy and the lies from the Soviets as the moral justification for their outrage rather than the strategic parity.
Bundy later admitted that the idea of Soviet warheads next door was, for reasons Americans didn't really analyze, simply insupportable.
Despite all this, Kennedy's bottom line didn't change. He closed that first day still saying, we're going to take out these missiles. But the debate had successfully shifted the options away from a massive, immediate strike.
By Wednesday morning, October 17th, the military planners were deep in the details of a potential air campaign.
And the scale of what they were proposing was, frankly, staggering.
The Joint Chiefs produced a formal menu of 5 different air campaigns.
Plan I was the most limited, 52 sorties, just hitting the missile sites and any nuclear storage areas.
Plan 2 added the nuclear-capable aircraft, bringing it to 104 sorties. These were still in the realm of a surgical strike.
But then Plan 3 expanded the target list dramatically to include all other Cuban aircraft, SAM sites, cruise missiles. So that was 194 sorties.
Plan 3 went to 474 sorties, hitting all military targets except for tanks.
And then there was Plan V, the full prelude to an invasion. It called for 2,002 sorties.
2,000. Just a devastating attack on the entire island's military infrastructure. It would have guaranteed massive casualties and made an invasion inevitable. That was the military's preferred option.
The civilian leaders, though, were still debating whether to give a warning first. But McNamara and Taylor were arguing against it.
They feared a warning would remove the element of surprise and give the Soviets a chance to get a missile off the ground.
At the same time, pressure was coming from the outside. Adlai Stevenson, the UN ambassador, sent a memo to Kennedy.
Stevenson was urging diplomacy. He wanted to send emissaries to both Khrushchev and Castro.
He argued that starting a nuclear war would be divisive at best, and that the existence of missile bases anywhere should be negotiable.
But the Kennedy team had a well-known bias against Stevenson. They saw him as a weak man, all words and no action.
His advice was largely dismissed, seen as not tough enough for the moment.
George Ball also kept arguing his point that Khrushchev didn't understand what he'd done and that strategically the missiles changed nothing.
But that view was losing ground. The consensus in Excom was forming that, for political reasons if nothing else, the missiles had to go.
And to bolster the case for military action, they started consulting with hardliners.
John McConney briefed former President Eisenhower, who called the situation intolerable and promised his full support for military action.
And they brought in Dean Acheson, the ultimate Cold War hawk.
When Acheson saw the photos, he urged immediate bombing. He said the weapons are pointing at our hearts and ready to shoot.
Interestingly, though, he opposed an invasion. He didn't trust the military not to escalate things beyond control.
His support was for a limited, surprise strike, not the all-out war the chiefs seemed to want.
So by Thursday morning, October 18, a consensus seemed to be forming inside the room.
It was. The dominant view was that direct military action, probably a bombing run, followed by an ultimatum, was going to be necessary.
McNamara's blockade option was seen as the weakest choice. It looked like they were heading for war.
But then McNamara, once again, reframed the entire issue. He repeated that this wasn't really a military problem because the U.S. nuclear advantage was so overwhelming.
He called it a domestic political problem.
By which he meant the president had to act because he had promised he would. It was about managing the inevitable fierce reaction of the American people. It was about credibility.
And that political framing brought his preferred option, the blockade, back to the center of the discussion.
He proposed the blockade, combined with very open, around-the-clock surveillance of Cuba to show the Soviets that they knew everything.
And he added a terrifying condition to it.
Yes. The president should publicly state that if the Soviets so much as looked like they were going to use the missiles already in Cuba, the United States would respond with a full-scale nuclear attack on the Soviet Union itself.
So it was action, but constrained action, with the ultimate threat held in reserve.
The choices were now starkly defined: the fast-track airstrike or the politically framed blockade. And the decisions made in those first secret, agonizing 72 hours had set the course for what was to come. The raw uncertainty of it all is what's so chilling. Nobody knew if their next choice would be the one that triggered the end of the world.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available right now. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.